The bullet tore through her shoulder before she even heard the gunshot. Elena collapsed onto the cold tile floor of Rosie's diner, her worn apron soaking crimson as screams erupted around her. The elderly man she'd just shoved aside stared down at her with eyes that held something she couldn't identify. Not shock, not fear, but something far more dangerous. Recognition. In that frozen moment, as her vision blurred and pain consumed every nerve in her body, Elena had no idea that the frail-looking stranger she'd saved was General Marcus Webb, a man whose classified operations had toppled dictatorships and rescued hundreds of hostages across 4 continents. She didn't know that the shooter wasn't some random criminal, but a Venezuelan assassin who'd been hunting Webb for 11 years. And she certainly couldn't have predicted that her split-second decision to protect a stranger would set into motion a chain of events that would transform her entire existence. Because Marcus Webb never forgot a debt, and the debt he now owed this minimum-wage waitress was one he intended to repay in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. But first, he needed to make sure she survived the night. Elena Martinez had worked double shifts at Rosie's diner for 3 years straight, and she'd never once complained. Not when her feet swelled so badly she could barely walk home. Not when customers left $2 tips on $50 tabs. Not even when her landlord raised the rent for the 4th time in 18 months. At 26 years old, Elena had already buried both her parents, dropped out of nursing school to care for her dying mother, and accumulated enough medical debt to drown a small country. But she showed up every single day with a smile that somehow still reached her eyes. The regulars loved her. Old Mr. Patterson always requested her section. The truck drivers from the nearby highway tipped her extra because she remembered how they took their coffee. Life wasn't easy, but Elena had made peace with it, or so she thought. Before you hear what happened next, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from right now. I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our stories. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now, let me tell you about the night everything changed. The evening of November 14th started like any other. Elena arrived at 5, tied on her apron, and began her routine. The dinner rush hit hard around 6:30, filling every booth with hungry families and tired workers seeking comfort food. She barely noticed when the old man walked in alone. He looked like 100 other seniors she'd served, weathered face, gray hair, slightly stooped posture. He chose a corner booth facing the door, which she thought nothing of at the time. He ordered black coffee and the meatloaf special, speaking in a quiet voice that carried an unusual weight. Elena brought his food and moved on, attending to a family of 5 demanding extra napkins. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. Everything felt ordinary until it wasn't. At exactly 7:47 p.m., the front door swung open with enough force to crack the glass. 3 men entered wearing black jackets despite the mild weather. Elena's instincts screamed before her mind caught up. Something in the way. They moved. Purposeful, coordinated, predatory. The lead man's eyes scanned the room and locked onto the corner booth. His hand disappeared inside his jacket. Time fractured into impossible pieces. Elena saw him draw the weapon. She saw the barrel rise toward the old man who sat calmly eating his meatloaf. And then her body made a decision her brain never authorized. She threw herself across the booth just as the gun fired. The impact lifted her off her feet and spun her sideways. She crashed against the table, sending plates and coffee flying. The old man caught her before she hit the floor, and that's when she noticed his hands. They weren't the hands of a frail senior citizen. They were calloused, powerful, and moving with terrifying efficiency. Before the shooter could fire again, something happened that defied everything Elena understood about elderly customers at small-town diners. General Marcus Webb hadn't drawn a weapon in active combat for 7 years. He'd stepped down from command after a mission in Syria went sideways, costing him 3 of his best men. The nightmares still came. The guilt never left. He'd spent the last 7 years living quietly, moving from town to town, avoiding the enemies he'd accumulated across 3 decades of operations most Americans would never know existed. He thought he'd finally escaped his past. He thought Millbrook, Nevada, with its population of 8,000 souls, was too small, too insignificant for anyone to find him. He was wrong. The moment those men walked through the door, Webb recognized the Venezuelan intelligence signature in their movements. He'd dismantled one of their most profitable arms networks back in 2013. Their top general had sworn revenge while bleeding out on the floor of a Caracas warehouse. Apparently, that oath had outlived the man who'd made it. What Webb hadn't anticipated was the waitress. He'd clocked her the moment he sat down. Kind eyes, exhausted posture, the practiced smile of someone carrying too much weight. She was nobody, a civilian working a dead-end job in a nowhere town. Yet she'd thrown herself into a bullet meant for him without hesitation. As she collapsed in his arms, bleeding heavily from her shoulder, Webb felt something crack open inside his chest. He hadn't felt protective of anyone since losing his men in Syria. He'd numbed himself to human connection, convinced it only led to pain and failure. But watching this stranger sacrifice herself for someone she didn't know awakened something he thought had died permanently. The shooter was still standing, still armed, still dangerous. Webb looked up at him with eyes that had witnessed horrors most men couldn't imagine. The shooter hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything, because what happened in the next 4 seconds would become local legend. Webb moved like violence given human form. Despite his 63 years, his muscle memory remained razor sharp. He lowered Elena gently, rose from the booth, and crossed the 12 feet separating him from the shooter before anyone could scream. His first strike collapsed the man's windpipe. His second disarmed him with a wrist manipulation that produced a sickening snap. The other 2 attackers reached for their weapons, but they were already too slow. Webb had survived ambushes in Fallujah, assassinations in Karachi, and a torture session in a North Korean black site that lasted 19 days. 3 hired guns in a Nevada diner presented no challenge whatsoever. He neutralized all 3 in under 8 seconds. When the dust settled, 3 men lay unconscious on the floor. The other diners cowered behind overturned tables, and Webb stood alone in the center of the chaos, barely breathing hard. Then he remembered Elena. He dropped to his knees beside her, applying pressure to her wound with hands that had ended countless lives but now fought desperately to save one. Her blood pooled beneath them, warm and spreading. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, finding his face. She tried to speak but couldn't form words. Sirens wailed in the distance. Webb leaned close, whispering something no one else could hear. A promise. A vow. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would repay what she'd done for him. He had no idea that repaying this debt would force him to confront everything he'd spent 7 years running from. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. Elena's heart stopped twice during the ride to the hospital. And across town, watching through a sniper scope from a rooftop, a 4th man reached for his phone to report that the primary target had survived. But now they had leverage. Elena woke 3 days later in a hospital room filled with flowers she couldn't afford and machines she definitely couldn't pay for. The first face she saw belonged to the old man from the diner, except he looked different now. Harder, more alert. The frailty she'd initially perceived revealed itself as carefully constructed camouflage. He sat in a chair beside her bed and she noticed 2 men in dark suits standing outside her door. Men with earpieces. Men with bulges beneath their jackets. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her shoulder, forcing her back against the pillows. Webb raised a hand, gesturing for her to stay still. Then he began talking, and nothing about her life made sense anymore. He told her about his career, the operations he'd commanded, the enemies he'd made. He explained that the men who'd attacked the diner weren't random criminals but trained assassins who'd been hunting him for over a decade. He told her that by saving his life, she'd inadvertently placed herself in their crosshairs too. The Venezuelan network now knew her face, her name, her address. They would use her to get to him. Unless he protected her. Elena listened, her mind reeling. This felt like a movie. some absurd action thriller playing out in her ordinary existence. She was a waitress. She served coffee and meatloaf. She worried about rent and student loans. She didn't belong in a world of assassins and special forces commanders. But the bullet hole in her shoulder argued otherwise. Webb finished speaking and waited. The choice, he said, was hers. She could refuse his help, return to her normal life and hope the Venezuelans forgot about her. Or she could trust him, let him move her somewhere safe, and accept resources that would change her circumstances permanently. She had exactly one question, and the answer she received made everything infinitely more complicated. "Why were you in Millbrook?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse from days of disuse. Webb hesitated, and in that hesitation she glimpsed something unexpected. Pain. Old wounds that hadn't healed. He told her about Syria, about the 3 soldiers who died under his command because of intelligence he'd trusted. He told her about the guilt that had driven him to disappear, to wander from town to town like a ghost, searching for somewhere to finally rest. He'd chosen Millbrook because it reminded him of the small Tennessee town where he'd grown up, before the military, before the missions, before everything good inside him had been slowly replaced with operational efficiency. He'd been trying to remember who he was before becoming what the world had made him. Elena watched his face as he spoke, and she saw something she recognized. Brokenness, loneliness, the weight of carrying too much for too long. She'd seen that same expression in her mother's eyes during those final months, in her own reflection during the darkest periods of grief. Webb wasn't some invincible superhero. He was a tired man haunted by choices that had cost him everything that mattered. Something shifted in Elena's chest. Maybe it was the pain medication. Maybe it was the near-death experience reshaping her priorities. Or maybe she simply recognized a kindred spirit beneath all that military hardness. Whatever the reason, she made a decision that surprised them both. She wouldn't just accept his protection. She would offer something in return. Because somewhere beneath all his competence and deadly capability, Marcus Webb was as lost as she was. And Elena Martinez had always been better at taking care of others than herself. The next 6 months transformed Elena in ways she never could have predicted. Webb moved her to a secure property in Montana, a sprawling ranch surrounded by mountains and protected by security, systems she couldn't begin to understand. He covered her medical bills, all of them, including the debt from her mother's treatments. He arranged for her to complete her nursing degree through an accelerated online program at a prestigious university. He provided everything she'd spent years dreaming about and never believed she'd actually receive. But the real transformation happened slowly, through countless conversations over morning coffee, through shared silences watching Montana sunsets, through the gradual dismantling of walls they'd both built around their wounded hearts. Webb taught her self-defense not because he expected her to fight, but because knowledge brought confidence. Elena taught him something far more valuable: how to forgive himself for failures he couldn't have prevented. The guilt he'd carried from Syria hadn't protected those soldiers. It had only poisoned the years that followed. On the anniversary of her shooting, Elena stood before a mirror in her new bedroom, tracing the scar on her shoulder. It had healed into a raised pink line, a permanent reminder of the night her life had fractured and reassembled into something unrecognizable. She'd gone into that diner as a struggling waitress without hope or direction. She'd emerged as someone who mattered to a man who'd shaped history from the shadows. But their peaceful interlude was ending. Webb had received intelligence that the Venezuelan network was reorganizing, planning something larger than a simple assassination. They'd discovered his location. They were coming. And this time they weren't sending 3 men. They were sending an army. What Elena did next shocked everyone, including herself. When Webb presented evacuation plans, offering to relocate her somewhere even safer while he handled the threat alone, she refused. She'd spent her entire life running from things, from grief, from debt, from the crushing weight of circumstances she couldn't control. She was done running. Webby argued. He explained the tactical realities, the body counts, the near-certain violence that awaited. He told her she was being foolish, emotional, naive. Elena listened patiently, then asked him a single question that stopped his arguments cold. If our positions were reversed, would you leave? He couldn't answer. He couldn't lie to her. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Webb's former colleagues began arriving at the ranch, men and women who'd served under his command, who'd retired to quiet lives across the country, who emerged from their own forms of hiding when they learned their old commander needed help. They came because Webb had led them through impossible situations and brought them home alive. They came because loyalty, once forged in combat, never truly faded. Elena watched these reunions with something approaching awe. These weren't just soldiers. They were a family bound by experiences she would never fully understand. And somehow, impossibly, they accepted her as one of their own, because she'd taken a bullet for the man they'd follow into any fire. The night before the Venezuelan forces were expected to arrive, Elena sat on the ranch's front porch beside Webb, watching stars appear across the Montana sky. "I should be terrified," she admitted, "but I'm not." "Is that strange?" Webb considered her question seriously, the way he considered everything. Fear is useful when it sharpens focus. It becomes problematic when it paralyzes action. You're not experiencing absence of fear. You're experiencing mastery of it. There's a significant difference. Elena smiled. "You make everything sound like a military briefing. 30 years of habit. Difficult to unlearn." They sat in comfortable silence, breathing mountain air that tasted like pine and possibility. Tomorrow would bring violence, uncertainty, outcomes neither could guarantee. But tonight, in this precise moment, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since before her mother's diagnosis. Peace. Complete, unexpected, unearned peace. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me. That night in the diner, I was invisible. Another waitress, another struggling nobody in a town full of struggling nobodies. You could have left me on that floor after the attack. Disappeared. No one would have blamed you." Webb turned to face her, and his eyes held depths she was still learning to navigate. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet for a stranger," he said. "In 63 years of life, across 30 years of military service, I've never witnessed a purer act of courage. You were never invisible, Elena. I simply had the privilege of being present when you revealed exactly who you are." The attack came at dawn. What followed would test everything Elena had learned, everything she believed about herself, and everything she thought she knew about the quiet old man who'd walked into her diner seeking meatloaf and found something far more valuable instead. The Venezuelan forces numbered 47. Webb's assembled team totaled 12 plus Elena. By any tactical assessment, they should have been overwhelmed within minutes. But these weren't ordinary veterans. They were the best operators Marcus Webb had ever commanded, men and women who'd accomplished missions that remained classified at the highest levels of government. And they weren't fighting for money or ideology. They were fighting for family. Elena stayed inside the ranch house, monitoring communications as Webb had taught her, coordinating information between teams spread across the property. She couldn't fire a weapon with deadly accuracy. She couldn't engage in hand-to-hand combat. But she could be useful. She could contribute. She could matter. The battle lasted 4 hours. It cost them 2 wounded, none killed. The Venezuelans lost 31 of their 47, with the remaining 16 surrendering when their leadership structure collapsed. Among the captured was the man who'd orchestrated the entire operation, the son of the General Webb had killed in Caracas 11 years earlier. A son seeking vengeance for a father he'd barely known. As authorities arrived to process the aftermath, Webb found Elena standing on the porch where they'd watched stars the night before. Her hands were shaking, delayed shock finally breaking through, but her eyes were clear, focused, alive in a way they hadn't been when he'd first seen her carrying plates across Rosie's diner. 1 year later, Elena graduated from nursing school with honors. She took a position at a veterans hospital in Montana, specializing in treating the invisible wounds that soldiers carried home from wars most civilians never saw. She bought a small house near Webb's ranch, visited for dinner twice a week, and found herself building a life she hadn't known was possible. The scar on her shoulder faded but never disappeared entirely. She didn't want it to. It reminded her of the night she'd stopped being invisible, of the moment she'd discovered courage she didn't know she possessed, of the stranger who'd turned out to be legendary, and the legend who'd turned out to be beautifully, brokenly human. Webb never fully retired. Men like him rarely did. But he stopped running. He stopped punishing himself for failures that weren't his fault. He allowed himself to care again, to build connections, to exist as more than a ghost drifting through small towns, searching for peace he'd never find. Elena had given him that gift without intending to, and he'd given her one in return. Not the money or the education or the security, though those changed her circumstances permanently. The real gift was simpler, more profound. He'd shown her that a single act of selfless courage could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. That ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things. That taking a bullet for a stranger wasn't foolish. It was fundamentally human. And humanity, in all, its messy, beautiful, complicated glory, was worth protecting. Always. Sometimes the universe tests us with impossible choices. Sometimes a random Tuesday night in a roadside diner becomes the moment that defines everything that follows. Elena Martinez walked into Rosie's diner expecting nothing more than sore feet and small tips. She walked out, carried out, as the woman who'd saved a legend's life and, in doing so, discovered her own. We never know when our moment will arrive. We never know if we'll rise to meet it. But Elena's story proves something important. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the presence of something greater, compassion, connection, the instinctive need to protect another human being even when the cost might be everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that extraordinary things happen to ordinary people, then I have one request. Subscribe to this channel and tap that notification bell. We share stories like this every week, stories of courage and transformation and the beautiful unpredictability of human connection. And drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Elena's position. Would you have taken that bullet? Be honest. Your answer might surprise you. Until next time, remember, you're one moment away from discovering exactly who you are. Make it count.